Hello, everybody. I'm Pasha Marlowe, and this is the Let Pleasure Be the Measure podcast. I'm so excited to bring you a wide range of guests. And today I bring you Ari Tuckman. Ari Tuckman is a clinical psychologist, a certified sex therapist, speaker, and author. I am thrilled to connect with you, Ari, because I've recently been delving into the world of ADHD and sexuality and how both of those things are related to pleasure in the largest sense of the word, how it brings us joy and desire and energizes us for the work that we love. So I'm excited to have you here.
Yeah, well, it's fun to be here, and we have a great friend in common, Kirsten Milliken. So she's bringing two worlds together. It's a good thing.
Yes, Kirsten Milliken was a previous guest and a dear friend of mine who wrote Play DHD. And every time I meet with her, we talk about ADHD and play and creativity and a million other things, of course, in the same breath. But yeah, it always lights me up. I'm recently diagnosed with ADHD, although I'm 100% certain I've been struggling with it all my life. But I was one of those people at 50 to finally get diagnosed and then go on medication. So this has been maybe 6 months or 7 months now, and have become highly productive since then. And it has affected my relationship, both positively and negatively, which I'd love to talk to you about how ADHD affects relationships. And my husband identifies as ADHD inattentive. So it's an interesting dynamic.
I mean, the thing of it is, if you're, I don't know, 30, 35 or older, the odds of you being diagnosed as a kid are really low. If you're female, the odds are even more low. If you're mostly inattentive, so like disorganized, distracted, poor time management, procrastination, losing things, right? So that side of stuff, right? If you're not super hyperactive, like Dennis the Menace, Calvin and Hobbes kind of kid, right? You're not being diagnosed younger. So there's this whole generation or two of folks who are your and my age and above who were not diagnosed as kids, but maybe they have their kids who get diagnosed. And then you get what I call the 2-for-1 diagnosis, where one of the parents goes, damn, that sounds familiar.
Right.
Or they look at the other one, they say, damn, that sounds familiar. So that, and yet, like, the ADHD isn't new, right? You're having ADHD isn't new. It's you're being identified as having ADHD that's new. So yeah, it really does become this whole, like, I kind of describe it as it's like reading the last chapter in the mystery novel.
Yes.
And you're like, oh, that's why the butler's hands were wet. Like, it all makes sense.
Well, and I'm grateful for the fact that when I received the diagnoses, I was thrilled. First, I was relieved, and I relieved a lot of shame. And then I just delved right into creativity and hyper productivity and what else can I learn? I just saw it as a superpower immediately. Is that a common reaction for people in their adulthood when they receive the diagnoses, or is there a lot of fear and
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that really kind of goes all over the place. And it's often, I think, actually a mix of emotions that some of it is, it's like anger and regret and sadness of like suffering that didn't have to be suffered. Like, God damn it, why did all this have to be so hard? Why did no one know? Blah, 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 right? All of that, which I totally get. And there's also this sort of thing of like, oh man, now I know, now it all makes sense. Now everything is coming together. And especially if someone, tries medication, which generally speaking, the medication for ADHD works really quite well and very tolerable side effects, and it's not addictive and all that kind of nonsense, right? So like, it's this thing of like, it's like all of a sudden getting a pair of glasses where you're like, whoa, I can see stuff now. Wait, is this what it's supposed to be like? And there's this amazing clarity that comes in this sense of like, finally, now I can put the pieces together and really do the stuff in life that I want to do.
Yes. And because my ADHD presents so differently than my husband's, and his ADHD, frankly, has been frustrating me for now 14 years because he does do things all the time and he can't remember seemingly anything. So we joke in the house that in the time he goes to the grocery store, I can produce a podcast and a comedy show and write a book. And then it actually feels pretty accurate.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so do you work with couples often where one person is diagnosed, or do you often work with couples where it's both?
I mean, definitely the folks who show up in my office, it's much more only one partner has been diagnosed with ADHD. Now, the question, of course, becomes maybe the reason why none of the both ADHD couples show up is because they're living in marital bliss, right? They don't need a therapist. They're doing awesome, right? Like maybe that's what it is. So I think some of it is there's just fewer of those couples out there. And I mean, it's like the good news, bad news of everything, right? The good news is if both people have ADHD or both people whatever, right? Like then you have more similarities. You're like, oh, I kind of get you. Except of course, even if you're exactly the same, you're still not exactly the same, right? So there's always going to be the differences. And I think in some ways, as much as yes, we do want complement or balance and similarity, we also want complementarity. Like I don't need someone who's good at what I'm good at. I need someone who's good at the stuff I suck at. So like you want a partner who's a good balance to you. And there's definitely that kind of cliche of the sort of disorganized but sort of dreamer optimist ADHD type with the kind of a little bit anxious but definitely really organized kind of non-ADHD type, like that pairing comes together because they balance each other so well.
Yes.
Somewhat. And they make each other crazy also, which is what we do in marriage.
It sounds like all marriages, really.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's just different things, right? It's just those couples argue about different things than the other couples do.
Yes. And you did a study that was so fascinating. And I don't know if you've done one since then, the 2015 sex study. Is that the most recent one?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the one. So so I did this gigantic survey asking about, so for couples with one partner who has ADHD, one person doesn't, and asking about all sorts of different aspects of their relationship and their sex life and, ADHD treatment and education and whatnot. So, as probably nobody will be surprised, there's very little research that's been done on how ADHD impacts a couple's sex life. Now, there's a ton of research on ADHD in general. So things like how does it affect academic achievement? How does it affect, like earnings potential in car accidents and, comorbidity with other conditions, and even stuff in terms of like health outcomes of like physical health outcomes and things like that. So lots of research in general on ADHD, but not so much on relationships in general, and definitely not as much specifically on sexuality. And yet, sex is a big important part of relationships, right? It's a big important part of life, and certainly it's a big part of pleasure and excitement and intensity and all. So it's important. And like we want these couples to be happy together, we want them to do well together. And part of what makes it easier to deal with just the annoying, boring, mundane parts of life and relationships of like, somebody has to load the dishwasher, right? Like you need that good sexual connection, that energy, that positive, vibe between you guys to get through the boring, annoying frustrations of life. So, so I feel like as a field and as clinicians, we've sort of been missing this massive lever that we can use to help these couples, and frankly, all couples, do better. And when the couple does better, the family does better. When the family does better, society does better. So, there's a lot at stake here if you want to get on a soapbox about it.
Right.
Which I do.
Which you do, which we are. Yeah. Because if there's peace in the self, then there's peace in the partnership. If there's peace in the partnership, there's peace in the family, and on and on and on. So I think that makes complete sense. And it's actually quite surprising to me that there hasn't been more research on it, because as soon as I was diagnosed, the first thing that I thought of was my recent reclamation with desire and claiming my sexuality as bisexuality at around the same time I was diagnosed. And then out of nowhere, like just a wave of women with ADHD who identify as bisexual have become my clients, and they're creative and they're fun and they're curious, And interestingly, their sexuality is very expansive. But to the point of your survey, most of them in the behind the scenes of all that expansive thinking and creativity and fantasy is quite a traditional monogamous, I'll say boring for myself, sexual relationship, which goes completely against all the other creative expansiveness I do in my work and personal life. So how did you make sense of the fact that people with ADHD, you would think, would be more interested in expanding their repertoire, but then they weren't?
Actually, in the data, what I found, so first of all, obviously I compared, men and women, right? You had to take, you got to take gender into account on these things. But then I also looked at ADHD. So men with ADHD versus men without, women with ADHD versus women without. So I wanted to separate out what's gender here and what's ADHD. And it was really interesting. It wasn't surprising when I saw it, but I didn't predict it necessarily beforehand, but that the folks with ADHD overall, compared to their same gender non-ADHD folks, overall actually tended to have much higher what I called sexual eagerness. So when I looked at the 12 questions that had anything to do with how eager are you sexually, so things like what's your desired sexual frequency, how often do you masturbate, how often do you look at porn, how quickly do you get turned on, do you have a history of consensual non-monogamy, do you have a history of non-consensual non-monogamy, meaning affairs and hookups, would you be interested in consensual non-monogamy? So like a dozen different questions. The folks with ADHD beat the folks without ADHD on 10 out of the 12, right? They endorsed higher levels of just eagerness, kind of generally speaking, and they tied on the other two. So absolutely, folks with ADHD at the level of group averages were more sort of in tune with sexual stimuli. They're more influenced by sexual stimuli. They're more interested in trying new things as opposed to doing the same old stuff. So yeah, I mean, there's very much, just as folks with ADHD are kind of like influenced by other potentially distracting stimuli, or, they're pulled by other interesting things, that very much applies to sexuality as well. And one of the things then that it means is, and this is where gender comes in, is overall men tended to rate higher on sexual eagerness than women. Now, probably some of that's biology and definitely some of it's society. So like, I'm not going to parse those out because, but men tended to rate themselves higher. Women tend to rate themselves lower. Folks with ADHD rated higher than non-ADHD. So what it means is when you have a couple with a straight couple where the guy does not have ADHD, but the woman does, they're actually a bit more similar. And sexually, they do better. And overall in the relationship, they do a little bit better. By contrast, when it's the woman who does not have ADHD and she's lower on sexual eagerness, and then you have a guy with ADHD who's a bit more, probably supercharged is too strong a word, although I know some of these wives would say supercharged, right? Now you've got a bigger discrepancy, and that's a harder, it's a harder distance to bridge. And those are the couples that are going to struggle more. So it becomes this thing that when the sex is good and we're feeling connected and we're liking a lot of the same stuff, and our desired frequency is not too different, it becomes this great positive in the relationship. And when the difference is too great, it becomes yet another discontent. It becomes yet another strain, yet another place where you're letting me down, or I'm feeling pressured, or whatever, right? So it really does go both ways. This is the trick for all couples, is how do we keep sex as a good thing in the relationship and not another bad thing?
And what is your tip on that? How to keep sex a good thing in a relationship?
I mean, some of it is, I mean, this is kind of obvious to say, but keep having sex, right? Keep making it a priority, and having at least one partner who's a bit more attuned to sex, is a bit more interested, is a bit more inclined to say, hey, it's kind of been a little while, maybe we should do something here. Like that can be a real positive, because somebody's got to keep it alive, right? You can't just vacuum and pay the bills, right? And yet, to keep the sex good, you got to deal with other stuff, right? You can't be an asshole by day and then expect great sex by night. Like that math doesn't add up. So you
But
got to do right.
the dishwasher plus laundry equals sex is math that does add up.
That absolutely adds up.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Good acts of service, right? Yeah. Kindness, generosity. I don't care about the dishwasher, but I know you do. Yeah. And I know, not in a manipulative way, but I know if I do the dishwasher, I'm more likely to get some tonight. So, okay, I can be a good sport, right? Like, this is just that like consideration of living together and being good to your partner and giving them what it is that is important to them.
Yes. And part of your survey was also, or maybe it was a different survey, but you spoke of sleeping in separate rooms. Is it typical that somebody with ADHD would have a harder time or more distractibility at night and possible struggles with insomnia?
Yeah.
Or snoring sounds are more distracting?
I mean, definitely folks with ADHD tend to be a bit more night owls. And so it's more likely that they're not going to bed, that partners are not going to bed at the same time. And, since often, especially if you have, kids in the house, often sex tends to happen more in the evening. Not that it has to, but just logistically it tends to. So, so if you're not going to bed at the same time, you're missing those opportunities. So that was definitely one of those kind of barriers to a better sex life that my survey participants, put towards the top of the list. So, and for some folks with ADHD, the problem is as their medication wears off, towards the evening, that they're more inclined to kind of wander through the evening. On the other hand, if you take your medication in the morning and you get more done during the day, there's less that spills over into having to be done at night.
Yes.
So yeah.
That works for me. And I found actually I needed to take the medication in the morning or it exacerbated my insomnia to take it too late in the day. So I take it in the morning and I'm very productive and I do all the things. But then frankly, if it's not on a sticky note by 3, I'm like nothing after 3 happens unless it's on a sticky note. So do you suggest I mean, I need a reminder. Like I won't remember to have sex. I'm already asleep in bed and like, oh, right, I did it again.
Yeah.
So how do you recommend folks to just remember? I know it sounds so funny that we forget, but I'll forget to exercise even though I teach it unless I write it down or it's in my schedule.
I think it's something, without being too kind of rigid about it, like, oh, honey, it's Tuesday, but there is something to be said for it, at least to be sort of intentional about it. Because like as adults, we're intentional about lots of things, right? Like I know the days I work out, right? I don't sort of find myself at some point in the week saying like, oh, maybe now is the time where I should exercise. Like, no, I know the days that I work out. And I'm not saying that you have to put sex on a schedule, but I think there needs to be some intentionality about it. And whether it's like actual sex, or whether it's just like the two of us spend some time together, like let's get the kids into bed and let's turn off the TV and I don't know, like Marty Klein has this awesome line, which is sort of sad but true, which is sex is a thing Americans do when they're too tired to do anything else. So it's like, no, this time for you and me is really important, which is why I allow it to be the very last thing that I bring the least amount of myself to.
Exactly.
Honey, you are so important. I'm going to give you the most tired, cranky part of me.
That is a true statement. Dynamic. That's so true. Yeah. And it's after you put the kids to bed and after the chores or whatever are finally done and the last email is read and you're mostly depleted and it feels a bit like an obligation at times, which is no longer pleasurable.
Yeah. So, the thought that I have, the real life recommendation I have, which is not like, oh, find a sitter and go for a spa weekend, which is a lovely fantasy, but like seriously, so is sometimes small differences make a big difference. So 15 minutes, a half hour makes the difference between I'm half asleep here and okay, I got a bit of energy, I can rally. So sometimes just small changes can make a big difference. Small changes during the day of doing a few more good things, also a little bit more looking for good things and what the partner is doing, not just being annoyed by the negatives. And a certain amount of sort of like willingness of I'm just going to show up and I'm willing to see what happens, because there's a lot of stuff that initially, even something as great as sex, like we're not necessarily like burning for it when we start. But if you allow yourself to be convinced, obviously in a consenting way, um, it's kind of like you get into the mood. So you can't necessarily judge by how you feel beforehand.
Yes.
And again, back to the exercise example, the majority of times that I work out, like I'm going to be honest, like when I walk down to the basement for my first set, I'm not like psyched to be there. Right. Now, by the time I've done a couple sets, I'm like, okay, yeah. All right, there we go. I'm
It's
all
the
right. This is good.
starting,
Yeah.
right? Starting, that's the hardest part. Yes.
Yeah, but I
Yes.
know like in 5 minutes, I'm going to be fine. I just need to get through 5 minutes. Or it's like jumping in the cold pool, right? The first 30 seconds is terrible, but then
Mhm.
you like it. You're like, oh, this is great. I'm glad I'm here.
Oh, and then
So,
you think, I should do this more often. This feels
right.
so good. I'm definitely going to do this every day.
Yeah,
Comes
exactly.
and it repeats and it repeats.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. The book I just wrote, which is called "My Next Husband Will Be a Lesbian," which
Hmm.
I understand is a very ADHD type title, is really about the feeling quite content in my marriage and feeling this relentless desire to try all things in the world,
Hmm.
all things, and to be able to express myself in an ethical way and in a
Hmm.
consensual way. And so you mentioned non-monogamy, and do you work with a lot of couples that practice non-monogamy?
I definitely have some.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the big portion, but I've definitely got more than one.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in the boring suburbs too. So, and yet I've got several couples right now currently in my caseload who either currently or have in the past engaged in consensually non-monogamous activities.
It's mostly all in our heads during COVID. It's like a non-monogamous,
Right.
the non-monogamous fantasy life that
Yeah.
this is getting us through the pandemic. Uh,
Right. Ooh, a
right.
trip to Cleveland. Yes, I'm in.
Exactly. And is there any connection between childhood trauma and ADHD? I know I just
Right.
turned, but that's my brain. Sorry. Thank
That's
you.
fine. So there is, but not in the direction you're thinking.
Okay.
So in other words, childhood trauma does not cause ADHD. Now, childhood trauma causes lots of other things, some of which could look a bit ADHD, but ADHD is more likely to cause childhood trauma. So having ADHD as a kid, you're more likely to be a bit impulsive about the situations you put yourself into, a bit more inattentive. So maybe you don't notice certain things. So you may find yourself in a situation that becomes traumatic. Um, but obviously we're not blaming the victim here in any kind of way, and it depends like what is the trauma. So like getting hit by a car versus being sexually abused by a family member. So obviously in that case, a kid having ADHD doesn't have anything to do with being sexually abused by a family member. So but I don't know, I mean, for all of us, right, we've got our burdens and our scars and our past to reconcile and deal with as we go forward and try to create a meaningful life and
Mhm.
interesting and pleasurable and everything else. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, these are all the pieces that perhaps fit together, and the one can, exacerbate the other.
Yeah. What about the high sensitivity? Is that correlated at all?
I mean, it can be in
Hmm.
the sense of folks with ADHD tend to feel their feelings a little bit more. They tend to wear them on their sleeve a little bit
Hmm.
more.
Hmm.
And, the sort of joke that I have here is if you do something in the spur of the moment and it works out well, then that means you're spontaneous. And if you do something in the spur of the moment works out badly, that means you're impulsive. Right. So,
Yes.
so like, so in some ways, folks with ADHD are a lot of fun to hang out with.
Hmm.
Um, on the other hand, it's also one of those things that if you're depending on them to, I don't know, remember milk at the grocery store, then maybe that's not as fun. But again, like we all have our, the good things that we bring to our relationship and the parts that make our partner crazy. So, it's all part of the package deal.
Yes. And I work in the field of therapeutic comedy, and I find most of the comedians that I work with also have ADHD, and
Yeah.
it's a superpower. It's perfect for comedy. Have you found
Yeah.
that to be true, that people with ADHD have either a sense of humor or actually do have a inclination to write or perform comedy?
There is definitely a lot of comedians who have ADHD. Now they may or may not have been diagnosed, but they got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that is definitely a true thing. And, I think some of it, I don't know. I mean, performing, like there's a thrill to it, and there's that kind of creativity, especially as a comedian when you're kind of working on material, and that ability to sort of twist an experience and kind of pull out the nugget of it, so
Yeah.
yeah, I think it fits in a lot of ways.
Okay. Interesting. And then just in terms of the pandemic itself
Yeah.
and experience of somebody living through this pandemic and feeling, I'll say, confined.
Yes.
And I've been able to find creative outlets, thank goodness, online. Had I not written a book, started a podcast, started a couple new businesses, and moved, I would have gone pretty nutty because I
Yeah.
needed that much stimulation to keep me engaged throughout the pandemic. Have you found that that people are being very creative in their ways of handling and thriving through the pandemic, those of your patients with ADHD?
I think it's been a mixed bag, right? I think that those who have done well with it are the folks who've done what you've done, which
Mm-hmm.
is they've said, awesome, my schedule has been cleared of lots of things that, let's be honest, kind of a bit mixed on at best. There's only so many soccer games we can stand on the sidelines of. Like, awesome, I got the time, let's do something cool with it. So there
Yes.
are definitely those who've risen to the occasion. And I think there's also a lot of people who haven't, right? They've just sort of like withered in the absence of opportunity. And, I think that, ADHD or not, it's a thing of like, here, life has brought you what it brought you. What are you going to do with it? And I know it's not that easy. It's not so simple, but I do think that that is still the universal of like, how do I find a way to make the best of the situation that I'm in? Um, and for all the terrible, terrible things of the pandemic, I got to say, there's some stuff about it I've actually really kind of liked. And the fact that things are getting normal again, there's a part of me that's kind of like, well, I think I'm going to rethink some of the things,
Yeah,
like, do I still got to do those? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Like, what do we want to do here? So it's a chance to kind of rethink things.
it is. It is. It's such a wonderful opportunity to create space for the things that did bring us pleasure throughout the pandemic, and see if we can continue to create that space after. I'm
Yes.
dreading the after. I'm dreading the after because this has been the most thrilling time of my life. These new creations online and this community that lives in my laptop of these play ADHD comedy centric people that out when I go to the grocery store are not surrounding me saying hello and
Sure.
hugging me. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a different world out there. And you have children?
I do. I've got one.
Okay.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So that definitely it keeps us busy. But he's 13, so now he's in the helping phase, as opposed to the like little tiny, make sure he doesn't die phase. So yeah, life has gotten easier.
Oh, good. I have a 13-year-old boy as well. And I'm assuming that ADHD is hereditary. Is
Yes.
it likely that if both parents have ADHD
Yes.
that the child does?
Let's just put it this way. I wouldn't bet my house, but I might bet my car. It's not that nice a car, but still. So yeah, only knowing these two data points that he's got two parents with ADHD, I'm going to bet a few bucks on that.
All right. Well, I will embrace all that. I will celebrate it.
Right.
Oh, so good. I'm excited to talk to you and learn about your work. I'm so thrilled that our friend Kirsten Milliken, the author of Play ADHD, connected with us. And do you bring play into your work often?
I mean, I do try to. I think it's that, and I mean, especially when I'm seeing, teenagers with ADHD like a lot of what we talk about, like, or at least a lot of the things their parents want us to talk about is the boring stuff they don't want to talk about. So it's schoolwork, it's chores, it's the, how do I avoid or minimize the negatives in my life?
Mm-hmm.
And fine, like we all have responsibilities, like I get it. And yet, that's not the thing that's going to light them up, right? So like it's not simply how do I get homework done so I can end the suffering, but it's sort of like what opportunities does this open up for me in the future? How do I enjoy myself in the moment? How do I feel good about what I'm doing? And or even just how do I get the homework done as quickly as possible at some decent level of quality so that then I can go and do that other thing that's more interesting. So yeah, I mean, it's got to be, you got to find something interesting and meaningful in your life where it's just a slog. And that,
Mm-hmm.
like certainly the last year has felt like more of a slog, but still, like there's got to be something fascinating, something interesting, something you're working towards, some project, something that
Yeah.
you're aspiring to.
Yes. Some sort of passion project on the side that I'm assuming for a lot of teenagers includes something on screen,
Yes.
like a game that they're very passionate about. I've relaxed my expectations of screen time as this pandemic has continued on, because
Yes.
I see that that's what lights him up, and
Yeah.
that's his pleasure,
Yeah.
and his social life actually too. Is
Right.
those darn games. But yeah, we bring play into our parenting all the time, and even to deal with some chronic pain and mental health issues, it's been incredibly useful. And in therapeutic work I do, bringing play into the therapeutic sessions, and then having the children or adults, whoever it is, um, if it's something like failure, saying like, what's your Hall of Fame biggest failure? What would you give yourself the gold medal for? And
Yeah.
so we reframe it through the lens of humor, and it releases a lot of shame around those.
Yeah. Well, but it's also, and I don't know, I think, chronic pain certainly really highlights it, but it's still a pretty universal thing in the sense of like, again, what are the things we can't do something about?
Right.
And then what can we? So, okay, this pain will remain. And like, fine, let's figure out how to minimize it or how to not aggravate the pain or whatever. And yet, life shouldn't be merely, I have as little pain as possible, right? It's sort of, you reduce the pain as a means to an end, which is, I want a life that's interesting and fulfilling. I want to be doing interesting things. I want to be with interesting people, right? So, like, so by filling your life with some of these other good things, maybe it distracts you from the pain that you can't otherwise do anything about.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Buddhist theory of, comparing pain to suffering. There, like, there
Mm,
can still be pain, but not as much suffering.
right. Right. Which sort of then circles me back to a quote I use a lot from Rick Green. He's a Canadian comedy actor who did the ADD and Loving It movie that showed all over PBS, I don't know, like 10 years ago. But he has this great line where he says, I used to suffer from ADD. Now I just have it.
Mm,
And
I
like,
like
that's
that.
it. Isn't that
That's
awesome?
it.
Like,
That's
that's
it.
exactly it, right? We all have the things that we could suffer from, but having it and suffering are not the same thing. And, I think that part of the not suffering or the reducing the suffering is to be very intentional. Here, we're bringing it all back, being very
You're wrapping
intentional,
this up so nicely.
right?
Thank you, Ari.
Is to be really intentional about bringing that, the pleasure and the fun and the meaningfulness in, because otherwise we're just suffering to suffer as opposed to suffering possibly for a purpose, but at least feeling like we're living an interesting life and that our relationship is satisfying, and certainly our relationship with our partner, but even just our relationship with ourselves. So, and I think that, sex and creativity and connection and all, like, it all comes together.
It sure does. Thank you. I so appreciate it when my guests wrap things up and circle back and close the loops, because that's the hardest part for me.
Right.
So thank you. Ending on a quote and a wrap up statement. Beautiful. Thank you, Ari. This has been a delight, a pleasure. It's been enlightening. Thank you.
Well, this is awesome. I'm glad that we met, and I hope our paths keep crossing.
I do too. If people want to reach out to you, I don't know if you take
Yeah.
patients on an individual level, or is it in a family, or how do you work?
I mean, I see individuals, couples, and families.
Okay.
I'm based in Pennsylvania. However, there are some states that are part of this cooperative agreement that psychologists from one state can see folks in another. So the thing is about 15 at this point. So depending on exactly what state you're in, I may or may not be able to work with you. But if you go to my website, adultadhdbook.com, I've got a bunch of information there, including a bunch of recordings of presentations and podcast interviews and things like that on ADHD in general and ADHD in relationships and sexuality. So that's the best place to find my stuff.
Yeah, it's a real wealth of knowledge and inspiration. I was going down that rabbit hole over the last few days, listening to your podcasts and reading your resources. It's excellent. And the books you wrote, what are the names of the books?
So the most recent is ADHD After Dark, Better Sex Life, Better Relationship. Before that, I wrote a book for clinicians called Integrative Treatment for Adult ADHD. And then another couple books for the public, one called More Attention, Less Deficit. And then the other one is Understand Your Brain, Get More Done.
Okay. You've been busy.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Again, meaningful projects.
Right. It lights you up and brings you pleasure, and it also heals and serves. It's beautiful.
Yeah, exactly.
Very good. Thank you, Ari. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you. For those of you out there who want to continue the conversation with me, feel free to visit me at pashamarlow.com or email me at pashamarlow.com. And then also please subscribe to the podcast so you can continue to get notifications on new and exciting guest interviews like this one. And spread the word, share it. It's new and I'm excited, and I appreciate all of you out there listening. Thanks again, Ari.
Thank you.